Hi there, everyone. Chief Meteorologist Andrea Michaels here, alongside meteorologist Grant Carlton. We're here to talk a little bit more in depth about our winter weather outlook. Of course, we've released it and we condensed it into something that was 4 minutes long that you might have seen on Fox 43 News at any given hour in the evening or in the mornings. So we kind of wanted to take some extra time to show you where our headspace was, where we came up with our prediction for the 2024 to 2025 season, because we don't get to include all those things. We've got to, squeeze it up into one tiny little present for you and open it up, so to speak, here. And it was pretty interesting this year, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely interesting. I've learned a lot. I was in North Carolina for the past 2 years, so this is somewhat my first winter forecast, and looking forward to it. And as Andrea said, we had a lot of the key points hit in the 4 minutes, if you did get to see that. But we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth as to each driving factor and how it's going to play out for the upcoming winter season.
Yeah, that's right. And before we get started on those conversations, we keep saying, at least you're new here, so maybe not you, Grant, but we've started this 2 years ago now. So this would be our third winter weather outlook. And as we've traditionally been starting to do, we're holding ourselves accountable for last season's forecast. So we'll start there before we move on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get a look here and see what we have going on. So this was what we forecasted for our temperatures.
Yeah, and as you can see, the average per year for a winter forecast, it's usually around 33.3 degrees. If you average all the nighttime temperatures, daytime temperatures from December to February, that's what you get. And last year, we were forecasting 1 to 3 degrees above normal, which is a good hedge above normal. However, it kind of impressed us a little bit more last year.
Yeah, it was actually warmer than we had projected. And despite the fact that we did get cooler chunks of air and even a little longer lasting, still the warmth showed. When we had the warmth really showed up, and I think that's really just what kind of helped outshine the colder, longer bursts of air that we had gotten. I know you were in here last year, Grant, but when we were talking about some of those bursts of cold air that we had gotten, especially earlier in January, it had been about 2 years since not only had we gotten that cold, but it lasted more than 2 days. So it was a big change of pace for our area.
Yeah, so to have, 5-degree increase in above normal temperatures last winter, definitely impressive whenever you had the cold air in place to get a few events that we saw last year in January.
Yeah, and let's get a check on the snowfall now, because that actually fell right within our predictions pretty much. Little nuances here that we're going to dive into, but we had forecast a 17 to 27 inch range. We had anticipated the swap to an El Nino and a little bit better of a polar vortex to help us out compared to, 5.7 inches from the year prior? Yeah, one of the worst snowfall amounts that we have had on record. It was top one or top two if it wasn't number one. It was really impressive here. And that we fell in our range.
Yeah, and to forecast slightly below normal is somewhat of a hedge because El Nino, that was the big discussion last year, and I think a lot of people did have their snow-colored glasses on.
Yes.
Even outside of Pennsylvania, I think a lot of people were anticipating at least a normal year because El Nino usually does give you that better setup for the bigger snow events if you get the cold air in place, and things just didn't line up necessarily for that one big event.
Yes.
There were a couple places that got luckier than others.
Yes, there were some. Particularly in February, there were quite a few systems where if you missed the ribbon of heavier amounts, there might have been a 5 to 6 inch difference between, and I'm just saying this hypothetically, Harrisburg International Airport, where those official numbers were taken, and then maybe just, a county over in Eastern Cumberland County somewhere. And we think that's why we fell in the lower end of that range, but in some spots might have actually been a little higher. Exactly. Yeah. But overall, it wasn't a terrible forecast, of course.
And it was better than 2022,
yes,
which La Nina was the driving factor. So we recorded 18.7 inches there, and of course the forecast right in the middle of that. So yeah, great job. Of course, I was not here last year, so it's been interesting to see how that verified. And of course, not necessarily talking about El Nino this time around.
No, instead we're flipping back to La Nina, so that's going to make it a little interesting. So while we might have checked off, our general ideas here, we're still going to have to consider a completely different setup compared to last year. So we'll continue to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Click ahead, Grant.
Yeah, and
we're going to give ourselves the green checks here quickly.
Yes, yeah.
Cha-ching, cha-ching.
Just to recap the cliff notes for last winter, the forecast fell in line for both of the key points. Snow total slightly below normal, and in terms of temperature, it exceeded than what we were forecasting,
yes,
but we
did
see
warmer.
Another above normal year.
Yes, but nuances aside, it was the general idea there. Now, obviously, we're talking completely different setup, not just because we're switching from an El Nino back, and actually it ended up being quite a strong El Nino. Not the strongest, but it did come in when I looked at the official numbers at the end of the season. Once you get into spring, you see those a little bit better. The average of months is kind of how they do it. It's complicated, so I'm not going to unpack that for you here. As much as this is a deeper dive, we won't dive that deeply into it. But it was a little stronger than even climate models were forecasting.
And I think it stayed a little bit longer in the El Nino phase. In terms of tropical weather, of course, La Nina, El Nino, very important with that. There was a very quiet start to the tropical season, which is good. Mm-hmm. And it was forecast to be a supercharged season. We have seen some impressive storms this year, more so in the later half of the year, though. So aside from Beryl, which was historic at the end of June, we had a very quiet June, July, and even early August in terms of the tropics. And that just somewhat showed La Nina was delayed a little bit. In fact, we are, I believe, still
we're still waiting.
Entering La Nina or in a La Nina watch.
The signs are there. We're just not officially where the criteria falls to declare it a La Nina. But the ocean waters, they are cooling. The signs are there that the change is taking place. It is just slower. And it was for that reason, too. You speak about the hurricane season. It's for that reason, too, that a lot of it was expected to be back-ended in the season, was because the developing La Nina would eventually catch on, and then that would have the traditional influence of aiding hurricane and tropical, just any kind of tropical development. But yes, so heading into winter, that could at least help us out at the beginning.
Yeah. I think if we look at October, of course, we had the fifth driest October on record.
So we're already seeing some of those signals, too. You'll recall when it was a really strong La Nina, you weren't here for that, Grant, but not this past first half of the year, but in 2023's spring,
February.
late end winter season, you'll recall we were having similar drought concerns. So we are already seeing some of those influences.
And some, record warmth. I believe that February of 2023 is when we had that record warmth, the dry conditions as well, all across the East Coast. And that is somewhat of a sign of La Nina. And nothing too confirmed yet in terms of us being in La Nina, but some early fall pattern here has definitely hinted towards that.
And just based on how I know when they officially declare it, it might not be until, say, the second half of winter at the rate that we're going, even though we are, slowly hedging from that neutral point up towards the number that officially they go and they say, okay, we are officially in La Nina from the climate scientists. So with that said, when we have a La Nina, just as a little bit of a refresher, you get those cooler waters along the equatorial Pacific. That generally does, at least eventually, once we start to, we're starting to see those signs, but generally what happens here is that you end up with drier conditions and warmer conditions along the southern United States, much of the southern United States, and a lot of that even creeps up the East Coast. Our storm track, too, that's big. This is what's going to be big this year, right, Grant?
Yeah, absolutely. And even if we do get, say, a wetter than normal winter, that storm track that we've seen a lot going up the Great Lakes, we're on that eastward side of it, and usually drags in the warmer air, so quote-unquote the warmer side of things. Even if we get the precipitation, the storm track, unfortunately, also not in favor of any snow, but it favors
more mixed precipitation scenarios where maybe you start off as snow, but then you transition to ice, and then you transition over to rain ultimately. So it really does limit our potential, especially, the farther west the track, obviously, the warmer and more towards rain you're going to be. If you can get some colder pushes of air, it might be some sort of hybrid. So we'll likely have a lot of that, and we think our totals, when we do our point location totals, will also reflect how that storm track affects Lewistown versus Harrisburg versus Lancaster too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that track is going to be key. And also if the cold air is in place, but it's hard to get that cold air to stick if you get a storm or a low lifting up the Mississippi River Valley into the Great Lakes. So something that we'll be tracking. And I think somewhat of a consensus is that that track could be more emphasized later in the winter as well.
Yes.
Maybe we see another February we get the warmth that we're kind of forecasting in February with the better chance earlier in the season.
And side note, historically speaking, La Niñas are known for producing very warm Februaries.
Yeah, and just like 2022 or 2023. So very interesting. So La Niña, of course, hopefully that explains why, if that track plays out, then that's going to be a big hinder in terms of the big snow totals for this year.
Yes, and not just, we looked at 3 of our big picture patterns. They have the word oscillation in them. It's our science-y terms, but there's another one called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And this one has been in its negative phase for a while, and this is what the negative phase looks like, Grant.
Yeah, and you said that we are near record or in record negative phase. So our hands are somewhat tied to forecast what a negative phase for the PDO would look like for us here in the eastern U.S. And it's not too much different than a La Nina type track where the general storm track you see are atmospheric rivers out in the Pacific Northwest, which they have had, some impressive events these past couple years in the Pacific Northwest, which has helped with the drought in California, somewhat of a benefit to them as well. But you get that troughiness, the low pressure sort of systems on the West Coast, and then
forces ridging here, which means drier for us and warmer, of course.
So that the PDO being in a negative phase and record negative phase just is another reason why we're forecasting a milder winter, and that storm track, again, not to favor those bigger snow setups.
Yes, and I do want to note, too, and just kind of follow up on that was a discussion point, I should say, when we were talking about this last season. There were some hints just because this is very, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's called the decadal oscillation for a reason. It's because it usually stays stuck in one phase generally for a certain amount of time, and then again and again. So it's very rhythmic. There's the word I was looking for. It's very rhythmic. So climate bloggers, I read a lot of climate blogs too before I do the winter weather forecast, just to kind of see if there are any details or nuances to keep an eye on. And they had said that, it's possible that a shift might come, even though we don't know yet historically. We haven't been studying this long enough to know what might force a shift or the reason, so we can't predict it. But in the times that we have seen at least a little bit of a flip or a movement more towards maybe a neutral or a positive phase, El Nino did actually help jog it along the way. Those warmer waters, would help force the warmer waters instead of the colder waters. So there was along the West Coast. So there was that small chance that, of course, El Nino might help nudge the PDO in the other direction, and it didn't. In fact, as you heard, it just got stronger this year. So we think with the La Nina setup, it's even more unlikely to get that swap that may or may not be coming. Let's assume it is coming. I think you just have a lower chance of getting that swap because they reinforce each other.
Yeah, and it's what's interesting is any precipitation, liquid or not, we somewhat rely on, in the wintertime, systems coming off of the West Coast, an impressive atmospheric river. So it could help in terms of getting the precipitation, but if the PDO climatology is right, then we're on that east side of the storm, the warm sector of it, and just two, La Nina and PDO, big factors into why we could see a milder and a less snowy winter.
And even so, historically speaking, you see right here, the wetter blob. That wetter blob, we just miss out on it. It's more so, your lower Great Lakes region, perhaps, the Ohio Valley, more than it's us. It might help with drought conditions in West Virginia because we've seen, as far as our drought conditions go, they've been strongest to our east and to our west, and it's been slowly starting to fill in across our area.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it might at least help out to our west, but whether or not we realize some of that help, historically, it's hard to say with certainty
and
make promises.
And of course, with storm track up the Great Lakes, you get the heavier rainfall rates, the higher totals of rainfall, even if we pick up a few isolated showers, not necessarily drought denting unless you get numerous.
Exactly.
So something interesting to see as well. And of course, don't want to completely eliminate the chance of a nor'easter or a big snow event. It's possible to get an atmospheric river or a big wave of low pressure off the west coast, and if it were to connect with somewhere down towards the Gulf, and if it were to steer to the Atlantic side of things or a little bit further to the east, then that would be a better chance. But just in terms of what the general storm track is with both La Nina and the PDO,
it makes it much more. It makes it that more unlikely. Yeah. And speaking of something that does help play into that role, because you need the cold. Yes, absolutely. That's the question. The storm track may not be in the favor, but if you get the cold to line up just right, we got to look to the polar vortex for that.
Yeah, and of course, you don't need the big snow events to get the snow. You could have those clipper systems that come out of the Great Lakes and just skirt up a mid-level disturbance. Doesn't have to be too impressive to get a quick inch or two. And that might be what we rely on if we get the cold. And of course, our next topic for our third big driver this forecast is with the polar vortex, or the QBO.
Yes, and this one is also pretty cyclic as well. Each phase, there is, as you probably are figuring out here, a negative phase and a positive phase to a lot of these. Yeah. Well, this is currently in a positive phase, which is the phase that locks the cold air up, and it lasts for 14 months.
It's a little counterintuitive. You think positive polar vortex, that's good for the cold air, but it's actually the opposite.
Yes, and it's been often, this is why it's so often misrepresented in the national headlines. They think, here comes the polar vortex, and it's like, a strong polar vortex means the cold air is locked up. A weak polar vortex actually means the cold's coming. Yeah. So, yeah.
So if you
I could gripe forever about it, but we won't do that.
There's a lot of things that people can run with in terms of weather terminology.
Yes.
It's always fun.
But when you have a strong polar vortex, it looks like this. Your cold is generally, stuck up near the poles. So it's hard to not only get those cold bursts of air, but it's hard to get them to last longer. And we're not going to shift back to the negative phase, which gives us a weaker polar vortex. We're not going to do that until well after the season. So, we can't even bank on any hint. So that's three things now, Grant, that say not enough warmth, storm track not looking good, cold air not looking good. Yeah. So, really, and these are I would argue the PDO, its influence isn't as strong as La Nina's or the polar vortex, but it's not helping its case either. Yeah. And this is something that has played a crucial role with how strongly negative it's been in the last few years. So when you have those three big factors here,
you see where the forecast is probably going. If you didn't watch the full one. I did want to mention something. I didn't know. This might be a little bit too geeky. I don't know, Andrew.
Oh my gosh, it's a podcast. You can geek out on a podcast,
we'll go back to the PDO or something here.
Yeah.
Something you have noticed before with the troughiness on the west in terms of the storm track and then it riding up the Great Lakes. If it's further amplified, you can get something called like the Omega jet stream. So you get the troughiness on the west and then a little bit of ridginess in the center U.S., which forces more troughiness on the east. And if anything, that might be one of our best chance if you get that
Omega
block. And but it's not a forecast. It's just something to think about.
It's something to watch for with the pattern.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's very valid.
And
we're going to have to grasp at these little opportunities this season by the looks of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And
of course, with the way we're talking about this, let's just reveal, Grant. It's obviously, Yeah, we definitely think it's going to be another below average snowfall season. And we think actually we've got a high probability of getting less than last year, not just being below average, but lower than last year and above average temperature wise.
Yeah, and temperature wise, so like we said earlier, the seasonal average from December to February is 33.3 degrees, and we are forecasting 35 to 37. So 2 to 4 degrees above normal, and that might not seem like a lot, but it matters a lot in terms of the overall warm pattern. And it could be nighttime lows that are well above normal, but it's hard to get the snow if it's not near that freezing mark in general. So.
Yes, exactly. And if the times that we get that cold air just don't happen to line up with the storms too, we've seen a lot of that happen the last couple of oh my goodness, I feel like it's the last 3 or 4 winters now where everything just seemed to fall short.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think this is a stretch. Based on how we did temperature-wise the last few years, especially because, now I'm going to get into analog years and talk a little nerdy here. Part of climate forecasting is looking at previous seasons with similar factors. So when I'm picking an analog year, as we call it, I'm looking for a year that had a La Nina and a La Nina at the strength that we're forecasting, which would be a weak, maybe moderate, but that might be a little gracious. Just because it's not emerging as quickly as anticipated, it's possible it might not even reach a moderate a La Nina. So I looked for weak to moderate La Ninas that lined up with a strong polar vortex and lined up with a negative PDO, and there was slim pickings. First of all,
you might not be able to find that year where you have all 3 of them lined up like we're expecting, but I think the 2022-2023 season is a very good year, and there has been some discussion in the community, and also you've mentioned about the warmth may actually be again later in the season, maybe into February if just going off of climatology.
Way more than not. I think our best chance for having those swings of cold air, just because we haven't fully adjusted to La Nina yet, would be December.
Yeah.
So December could be a little interesting, and it could possibly, just like it was, and you weren't here for this at the time, Grant, but I remember when we did that triple dip La Nina forecast, we knew that the best chance for a storm, at least a big one, would be in December.
Yeah, and we
did
got
get
the Arctic
those.
blast.
Yeah, we did, but it just did not line up with
the storm track.
any storms. Yeah.
And whenever it gets that cold, like I remember it was Christmas of 2022.
Yes,
it was like
oh my goodness.
Record-breaking cold. The wind chills
Buffalo,
were dangerous.
dangerous. I mean, you remember Buffalo in the headlines.
And that's a whole separate story. I mean,
Yes.
whenever we've had a very warm fall, those lakes are warmer than normal. And if you were to get a surge of cold air, say in December, you're probably talking about an impressive lake effect snow event again. But that's outside of our realm for right now. But yeah, we had the cold air in December. It was short-lived because I remember Christmas we had the near record cold, and then we were near record warm by New Year's Eve, and pretty impressive.
Crazy.
So
yes, and I will say there were 2, kind of circling back to the analog years, there were 2 years that I felt were the best representation of what we can expect, and with all of our factors lining up. And I'm just going to read this off. So the 2010 to 2011 season ended up being one of my analog years, and that actually ended up with 23.8 inches of snow. However, looking back, actually, this was even a moderate La Nina, so even that was a grasp. So that's not even fully perfect. As I take a look at my La Nina basin notes, we did have the positive polar vortex. We did have your negative PDO, but our La Nina was a little stronger. So that might have a little bit of, that might not have as much say. So it's worth saying that we did get that, but overall, that's still below average for our area.
Yep.
And the February temperature, if I may say, the February temperature was above average too.
And that
Yes.
year you were just talking about, 2010,
Yes.
2011. And that could have, I'm not sure, I haven't dug into the seasonal analysis, but it could have came from one storm. And it's not out of the possibility for the numbers we're about to show you to be busted or something. It just takes one storm.
January was the month that did it. January, there was 16.6 inches of snow. February was actually below average with only 6.5 inches of snow that season.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and it wasn't that. It was actually one of our milder Februaries, but not that mild. In fact, this is the year that I think best represents the picture, even though the PDO is nowhere near as strong as it was. But we had that weak La Nina. We had weak to almost moderate La Nina. We had our positive polar vortex, our strong polar vortex. And that was one of our low snow performances, 5.5 inches. February was 51.5 for the average high temperature. That is what is the average? The average is 42 for highs for February, just to give some perspective on how warm Februarys traditionally are. Now, I looked at every La Nina season since 1980. We don't go and look before that because with climate changing and the warming that we've been doing, the atmosphere is just not in the same place that it was in the 70s, the 60s. So we have to look more recently because it's a much better representation of what we deal with now. And, you know, only one season, and I have it, I didn't use it as an analog year, actually, but only one season had a lot of snow. It was 64. It was like 60. Oh, here we go. It was the 95 to 96 season where we had 62.6 inches.
That might be the blizzard of 96 that everybody talks about. Or
actually.
And
that would be it because that was in January, right? I believe.
Yeah, blizzard of 95 or 96.
It was 96.
My mom's probably.
It was 96.
Blizzard of 96.
So, but we had our opposite stuff here. We had a positive PDO, which means we get the storm track, we get the cold. We had a weak polar vortex. So these had influences with the La Nina. Yeah. So, I mean, I felt, the 1 year that was significantly overperformed, and this was the only year, too. The significant year was the only year we were above average.
Yeah.
I mean, just all signs point to below average snow, even if you're not looking more closely at these other details.
Yep, and it's important to look at the opposite scenarios as well.
Exactly, yep.
Even with La Nina in place, you have, and even outside of the PDO, QBO, or the polar vortex, I should say.
Yeah, it's technically called, there's this, okay, I feel like we got to explain a little now. So there's a pattern called the QBO, the quasi-biennial oscillation. That, it doesn't directly tell us what the polar vortex is going to do, but that setup tells us what to expect of the polar vortex, if that makes sense here. So it's not the polar vortex per se, but it does tell us what's going to happen with it.
Yeah, and there's a few other big oscillations or big climate patterns that have different time series. Some of them are monthly, weekly, not as short as weather, as obviously we can forecast within a week or so in advance because the jet stream changes every couple days. But there's a couple other things that will play into the winter forecast, but the three biggest ones we mentioned, which again
are these ones.
Yep.
And that's why we're saying, of course, the below average temperatures, but also, ding, 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 here's the snow part. We're finally getting there.
Above average temperatures.
Oh, did I say below? I meant above. I meant below with the snow.
We've nailed that.
But yes, above average. Yeah. My apologies.
And here comes the below average.
Yes,
snow.
here is the below average. So we think the range 9 to 19 inches. I think with the fact, and this was kind of my thought process, since this is a weak La Nina and not a strong La Nina, I don't think we'll perform as bad as we have with, and because I think December could be a little bit of a, I think it could help if everything lines up just right. But I think, just generally speaking, I don't think we're going to be as bad as we would if we had a stronger La Nina that has already emerged, so to speak.
Yeah, the 2022-23 year was 5.5. That was the total for
something
that.
Like that.
Single digit.
5.7. For snowfall, it was like 5.65. It was something like that. Yes.
Yeah, single digit, and obviously we're a little bit more hopeful. It's hard to beat that sort of low snowfall.
Yes.
And with the better chances in December, early January, with the potential cold being in place, that would be the time to look for it. But
Yes.
one thing I admired with Andrea's forecast is not being afraid to hedge that low. I mean, we have a single digit still on the board in terms of that
Yes.
10-inch range, and that really goes to show that we are sticking with the below normal year in terms of snowfall.
Yes, and I mean, I personally do feel like, I mean, this is as long as we don't get a big storm, this is very reasonable. And considering that our chance for a big nor'easter is going to be low just because of the general setup,
Yep.
I mean, this isn't out of the question here.
Yeah.
In theory, let's be real here, in theory, we could have said this range last year and been right, but maybe not for some areas that performed a little bit better than Harrisburg.
Yeah.
But the way we distributed our snow amounts were a little different. We thought everybody would be a little closer than normal, but because of the storm track we talked about earlier, we just don't think that's the case, Grant.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this number somewhat, you can interpret it as we're going to rely on more smaller snow events. So
Yes.
you might get a couple inches here and there from a clipper system.
Or a mixed precipitation event where you start as snow, change over to
Yeah.
sleet, freezing rain, ultimately go to rain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, one thing to keep in mind, which we're not necessarily talking about winter safety here, but of course, snow squalls, which really we're not counting snow squalls into this. That could easily dump an inch,
Yes.
though. And one thing to keep
Yes.
in mind about snow squalls is just they can come out of nowhere. It's important to pay attention to the forecast and have a way to get alerts on those days because they really, as you probably know, they can cause some dangerous road conditions quickly. And so that's something, of course, we'll keep updated with as well. But again, this is showing more of us relying on smaller snow events. It's not impossible to get a bigger nor'easter or a slow-moving low that has the cold air in place, but our hands are tied with in terms of
Exactly. All the signals, all of the big picture patterns and what they have historically done and how they shape our winter season. I mean, sure, there's always that chance. No science is ever 100% perfect. There's obviously that chance that there can be a storm that beats the odds, but again, it's unlikely.
Yeah.
And I don't want to have our range be higher just for the promise of one big storm.
yeah.
So
And we have a few bold
Yes.
predictions.
Yes, and this is just kind of to give a general roundabout idea. I mean, this is kind of more for funsies than it is because we actually think you'll get exactly 11 inches in Lancaster. But I like the visual of, how our snow the snow we get anyway will distribute itself across our area. And with a western storm track, and the warmth usually, making it in east of Harrisburg, that obviously means Lancaster, compared to the rest of our area, will be on the lower end, the receiving end of less.
Yeah, south of the Turnpike.
Yes.
I've lived in North Carolina for a couple of years. I'm from Pennsylvania, and everybody kind of talks about the Turnpike being a big cutoff for
Yes.
the rain snow events type of things.
Very often is because of the higher elevations to our west and to our northwest. Yeah.
And it could be sometimes you get Lancaster staying in the liquid side of the storm, and you might have Lewistown up in Mifflin County being
Mostly
a little
snow,
bit,
if not all
mostly
snow.
So something
So-
to pay attention to and realize that,
Yes.
especially when you get a setup like that, it's a matter of 20 miles in terms of
Yes.
does Harrisburg get the snow or does York get the snow? It really is a micro-sized forecast whenever
Yes.
you're talking about
Where it's
a rain snow event
The
like that.
teeniest thing, the
Tiniest
teeniest
change in
detail
temperatures 1,000
Yep.
feet above us. So.
makes all the
Anyway.
difference. But we think, generally speaking, Harrisburg does lean a little more towards warmer than it does colder. So that's kind of why we have Harrisburg's 14 inches a little closer to Lancaster. And then you'll see soon, we have Lewistown at the higher end of our range, obviously, anticipating you stay the coldest, you capitalize the most on that cold with the storm track and get a little bit more snow out of it than the rest of our area. So
Slightly
that was
higher
kind of,
elevation and-
yeah, that's kind of where our headspace is. And I mean, I don't see much to say otherwise. One of the things too, you're not just looking for all of the factors for something. I look for the things that also go against it to make sure I'm not overlooking anything, or to make sure that, I'm not totally dismissing another factor. Maybe I should be getting a little more weight. And this is just one of those seasons where I don't see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
that goes in line with, I think, climatology in general.
Yes.
If you look at Lewistown's average snowfall year, it's usually a little bit higher.
Mm-hmm.
But there's years where Lancaster could be the snow performer if you have that
El Nino pattern,
setup and the coastal lows.
which is why we had them closer, these numbers closer together last season.
So this year, hopefully you can get the picture. It somewhat makes sense a little bit further north and higher elevations have the better chance to get the cold air needed to get the snow to fall.
Yes. And I think that
Susan?
pretty much, I think that pretty much does it here. I think I hit all of my points. Did you have anything else you felt like you needed to throw in about this forecast?
No, I think I think we have a lot of fun putting numbers to it, and we have a lot of good reason to put these numbers out. Why we're hedging milder than normal and lower than normal with our snow totals. But at the end of the day, I think it's important to emphasize that it's the impacts that matter. Even 2 inches can impact your morning commute. The time of the day it falls, the wind, snow squalls, so many different things. I think a lot of people get carried away with the numbers, and sometimes it's more important to look at the impacts, which is why we are the impact meteorologists.
It's kind of the joke that's, I'm sure people are familiar with, where it's people drive safer in a foot of snow because they know it's not safe than they do in an inch of snow because they're like, it's not that much. It's just, everything, no matter what it is, we'll make sure we keep you up to date, and we'll make sure that we let you know what to expect, and we'll make sure we do everything on our end so that you have the information to keep yourself safe. So if you have any questions about this, you can find us on social media, you can reach out to us, send us an email. We'd be more than happy to answer any more in-depth questions that you might have. But I think we'll wrap this up here, Grant. I think we got everything we needed to out there. Absolutely. We'll see how we do.
We'll see how we do.
Yeah, as confident as we are now,
Excited.
Yes. As confident as we are now, ultimately Mother Nature will have the say. So we'll see if we figured her out this time or not.
Absolutely. Just a couple more months, we'll find out.
All right. Have a good one. Thanks for tuning in.